Hello everyone and welcome to another most impressive game from round 7 of the 2020 Tata Steel Masters edition. It's Alireza Firouzja versus Jeffrey Xiong, two young members of the 2700 club. Xiong is a bit older, he's 19, whereas Alireza is still only 16, but two of them play some really impressive chess. So without further ado, let's check it out as it's quite an intensive game. We have e4 by Alireza, e5. Knight f3, knight to c6, and now bishop to b5. The Ruy Lopez is on the board. Knight f6, we have the Berlin defense, and now d3. And we have bishop to c5, the newly called Alpha 0 Berlin defense. We have bishop captures on c6, d captures, and castles by white. We have knight to d7, defending the e5 pawn this way, and now c3. Preparing to push the d4 pawn all the way. We have castles by Xiong, and Firouzja goes for d4. And here there was one game e captures on d4. Nakamura played it against Anand in the Grand Chess Tour's Paris Rapid event. That game ended in a draw. But here we have bishop back to d6, adding another defender to the e5 pawn. Bishop to g5 now, developing, attacking the queen, and now f6. Pushing the bishop back, bishop h4, and queen to e8 now. The queen can now perhaps even go to h5 to g6, and well, even f5 might be possible in the future, as now the f pawn is no longer pinned. So rook to e1, and now there is one game where b6 was played. Anand played it in the Bucharest Blitz tournament against Liquang Liam. That game ended in a draw, but here we have knight to b6, and it is, as of move 11, that we have a completely new game, which again is very, very interesting, as it is the Berlin. So bishop to g3, countering black's dark square bishop, also adding another attacker to the e5 pawn, and now bishop to g4, pinning one of the attackers. So knight bd2, now the knight is defended. You might play h3 at some point to recapture with the knight, and king to h8. A useful move, as you don't want your king on this diagonal and constantly having to calculate queen to b3. So queen to c2, developing, connecting rooks, and now rook to d8, and h3 finally. So bishop to h5, not interested in giving up the bishop pair just yet, and now knight to h4 as the queen unpinned. So now, of course, you want to bring your knight to the f5, and if black wants to kick it away, he will either have to bring some pieces over or weaken the king even further with g6. So e captures on d4, now for the moment not allowing knight to land on f5, threatening bishop captures here. So bishop captures on d6, and now Xiong plays a very important Zwischenzug, a nice in-between move d3 before recapturing here, not allowing white to capture the pawn this way to improve his center. So d3, queen captures, and only now fixing his own pawn structure with c captures on d6. We have f4 by Alireza, and now bishop back to f7. We have knight d to f3, and now comes bishop back to g8, saying that, okay, now you could bring your knight to f5, but for the moment it's not really going to do anything. So what can you do here? Instead of bishop g8, you could try some other ideas, but for example, you could try to improve the position of this knight, but for example, if knight to c4, b3 just kicks it away, so not really gaining any new squares. And if instead you try knight to d7, then you weaken the d6 pawn. Knight f5 now comes very happily with a double attack on the pawn here. So instead, like I said, bishop g8, and now comes knight to d4. Now knight to f5 doesn't really pack all that much punch, because there's this tricky line queen to f7, and now if you go after the pawn, now you get queen to c7 with a double attack on the knight, e5 captures, and now knight to c4. The bishop nicely defends it there, and next move you're just gonna capture and win your pawn back, so it's not a problem. So instead, Alireza goes knight to d4. Now this knight can come to f5 as well. We have c5, bishop to c4 seems aesthetically pleasing, but other than that, it doesn't really do anything all that much. You're just gonna move the queen, and that's just it. So c5, pushing the knight d to f5, and now queen to d7. Queen to f7 is also possible here with the same idea, trying to get white to capture here, but here white can just play queen g3, put constant pressure on g7, and then bring the rook to d1 and go after the pawn this way. So Instead, we have queen to d7 by Xiong, defending the d6 pawn, and now b3, taking away the c4 and a4 squares from black's pieces, and now, as Alireza allowed it, d5, finally getting rid of the backwards the backwards d6 pawn. We have e5 by Alireza, and now bishop to e6, putting pressure on the knight here, knight back to g3. And now, you can even feel free to pause the video here and figure out what you would play here with black, you know, just as an idea how complicated the position is, while I give you a couple of seconds. So, for those of you who found the move that I'm about to show you, congratulations, as it's definitely not an easy move to find, but an even harder move to play in an over-the-board game, and that is g5. g5 seems to be weakening the king a bit too much, but after captures, and the knight moves, knight f3, it's actually a queen e7 defending, it's actually a solid position for black, and this is what seemingly should have been played. But okay, Xiong goes for f5 instead, he keeps the position closed, and now knight back to f3, just hoping to get the knight to this very nice g5 square. We have h6, not allowing it, but again, further weakening. Now the knight could go back, knight h4 to g6, but Alireza first goes b4. The idea is that he wants to remove the defender of the d4 square, he wants to get his knight there. And here, the way you want to defend c5 is knight to a4. This is how you want to do it. But Xiong decided that he wanted to play a bit more actively, so he went for a temporary pawn sacrifice. He played d4. And okay, we have captures on c5, and now d captures on c3, saying that if the queens are traded, then the knight can capture, and there is no more threat of pawn captures knight. So, after this d captures on c3 move, we have queen captures on c3, so now you're up a pawn, but knight to d5. Black now gains a lot of activity. Queen back to d2, and now queen to a4, putting a lot of pressure on the a4 pawn here, and also with a double attack on the f4 pawn. So here, Alireza goes knight to e2, defends the f4 pawn, and he says, okay, it's not a problem, you can win back your pawn. I'm just going to have a much more active play. And also the queen covers all the squares that the knight can use for some nasty discoveries, so it's not a problem, this relationship between the rook and the queen that does not favor black all that much. So knight to b4, now with a triple attack on the pawn, and also opening up a discovery here, knight e to d4. This was Alireza's plan all along, blocking this. So we have knight back to c6, adding now a triple attacker to the knight, just rook a to d1, giving back the pawn, but regaining the pressure. Bishop captures on a2, and now queen to c3, unpinning and continuing to play the game. So what can you do here? Well, as white will definitely start pushing the pawn here, the question is whether you want to capture on d4 and then play rook d5, or play rook d5 right away. Xiong decided for rook d5 right away. Point being that once the pawn starts marching forward, you can block it with the rook, and then this rook will be guarding the f5 pawn. So this is exactly what happens. Alireza starts pushing, rook to e8, and now rook to d2 by Alireza. Again, a very sneaky move, threatening rook to a1 to win the bishop here. So you have to move it, or play what Xiong played here, queen to c4, offering a queen trade as the queen on c3 is undefended. So queen captures on c4, bishop captures, and now knight captures on c6, b captures, and now again a very sneaky move by Alireza, rook to d4. Threatening to win the bishop and inviting a trade here. After knight captures, the knight will also be guarding e6, so it's not a problem. And if you grab the pawn, then rook c1 just wins the material. There's no way to get out of the threat here. So bishop to b3 by Xiong, and now rook to e3, again going after the bishop. Bishop to a2, and now before going rook to a3, which will come with a double attack, first e7, limit the movements of the rook as much as possible. King g8, you want to bring your king as close as possible, and now rook to a3, attacking the bishop and the a7 pawn. So here, first Xiong trades on d4, rook captures, knight captures, and now bishop to d5. An important move, defends the c6 pawn, but you cannot defend everything. You cannot defend this, this, and this. So first knight captures on f5, very important, as it again guards the pawn here, and it just eliminates a lot of black's counterplay. So if you ever want to get rid of that knight, you're going to have to weaken your structure even further. Because if you attack it with the bishop, then just knight d4 comes with an attack on the bishop and the pawn. That doesn't work. So g6, you have to get rid of the e7 pawn. Knight captures with check, king g7, and now knight to g4. Finally, rook captures on e7, but now knight to e3. Attacking the bishop, white is hoping to get bishop captures here so he can get a nice passed c-pawn. So bishop to e4, and now king f2. We have rook to d7, hoping to get rook to d2, check in, so knight to c4, guarding the d2 square with the knight. Rook b7, and now comes g4. We have bishop back to d5, and now again knight back to e3, hoping for knight captures on d5. We have rook to b2 with check, king g3, and now rook to b3. This is not an easy move to play for black because you're willingly trading rooks, well, sort of offering a rook trade, but rook to b7 guarding the pawn isn't good enough because of, again, captures and king f3, and it's just going to be very hard. Even though black is the one with the two passed pawns, it's not going to be easy. For example, rook c7, rook c3 defending. Now you can go d4, attacking the rook, rook c1, and now even a5, start pushing this pawn, but the white king is just much more active. a4, you're going to capture here. You're up 2 pawns now, so it's not even close. So, after this king g3 move, we have rook to b3 by Xiong, and of course Alireza not interested in trading because the a7 pawn hangs with check. So rook captures with check, king f6, and now king to f2, guarding. Rook b2 check, we have king to f1, and now the problem is black cannot continue checking. If you continue checking, rook b1 check, king e2, rook b2 check, you're gonna go king d3, rook b3 check, king to d2, and now after finally rook b2 check, you're gonna go king to c1. And yes, you do reach the h pawn. However, again, you have the problem of captures, and just rook a6 check. The pawns do not allow the king to come any closer. King has to go back, now g5, and yes, you do get the h3 pawn, but now king d2, not allowing rook c3 to put a rook behind the passed pawn, and, well, after rook f3, you're just gonna block with check. If you go there, then you can also grab this guy, and if you go here, then just c6, and it's, of course, a winning endgame for white. c7, c8, of course, coming. So, after king f1, bishop to e4, Xiong can never allow knight captures on d5, but now comes rook to d7. The rook can now also help out with the checks, so rook to h2, going after the h-pawn for now, but now rook to d4, forcing the bishop to come to d5. So bishop to f3, but now rook d6 check, king g7, and now comes the breakthrough f5 finally. So g captures on f, knight captures with check, king f7, and now g5. So the h3 pawn will be given away, but it doesn't really matter, because if you capture it right away, g6 check, if you go here or here, it's just a rook to d8 mate, so you have to go king to e8, g7 is coming, there's no stopping this, so it's really just pointless. King f7, rook d8 again. No stopping the pawn. So after g5, bishop to h5, now preventing g6, but rook to f6 check. We have king to g8 and now g6. There was no stopping this. Rook captures on h3, you don't have really a better move. Now knight to e7 check by Alireza. And now if you go king g7, the problem is you get rook f7 check, king h6, rook h7 check, king goes to g5, and now g7 wins the game. There is no way to prevent queening other than playing bishop to f7, but then just rook captures on h3, and it's game over. So, after knight e7, king to h8 was played by Xiong, and now feel free to pause the video and try to find the winning move for white while I give you a couple of seconds. So, for those of you who were able to do it, congratulations on paying attention, as it's basically just forcing black into the line we've just shown, rook f8 check. This is what Alireza played, king g7, and now we go into the line that we've just discussed, rook f7 check, king to if king h8, then rook h7 is mate, the knight covers g8. So after rook f7 check, king h6, rook checks, king g5, and now g7. And it was in this position that Jeffrey Xiong resigned the game, and yet another victory for Alireza Firouzja in this tournament. So from 7 games, 4 wins, and all 4 with the white pieces. which is very interesting because the next player Alireza will have white against is Magnus Carlsen. So will be very interesting. Will Alireza continue his winning streak with the white pieces, or will Magnus continue his undefeated streak for who knows how many games now, maybe even 115 until then. And again, it's the same line, so there's no way to stop the pawn. You have to go into this, but then just rook captures, and it's just pointless. So yeah, that's what I wanted to mention. Here are the standings after 7 rounds. There we have it. Alireza Firouzja in sole lead with 5 out of 7. Incredible stuff. And there you can see his performance rating is almost 29,000, 2,900, 2889. Followed by Wesley So and Jordan Van Forest with 4.5. Then with 3.5 points, we have a lot of people. Yang Krzysztof Duda, Fabiano Caruana, Magnus Carlsen still doing the Giri, Vishwanathan Anand, Danil Dubov, Anish Giri, and Vladislav Artemiev. With 3 points, Jeffrey Xiong. With 2.5, Nikita Vityugov and Yu Yang-gi. And with 1.5 points, still in last place, Vladislav Kovalyev, not able to catch a break just yet. And also with this win, on the live ratings, Alireza breaks through into the top 20 chess players in the world. There you have it. In number 19, there you have it, Alireza Firouzja, who surpassed Andreikin, Artemiev, Wei Yi, Vityugov, Nakamura, Topalov, and now, to catch up to Karakin, Kramnik, and the rest of them, he needs quite a few more wins, but top 20, he definitely joins the elite. So yeah, that's the game. I do hope you enjoyed it. Next game, Alireza has black against Van Forest, also one of the, well, not the leaders, but him and Wesley are trying to catch up to Alireza now. And then in round 9, white against Magnus. That's gonna be a crazy game. So yeah, once again, I would like to thank Ken Thompson, Christopher Gordon, Frank Combs, Salvatore Giambrone, and Christelle Day for your contribution to my channel. Thank you a lot. I really appreciate it. As usual, you can check 2 of my previous videos here. Thank you for watching, and I will see you soon, continuing the coverage of the Tata Steel Chess Tournament, the coverage of the Women's World Chess Championship, checking up on your suggestions, and of course, whatever else happens in the chess world. So thank you all, I will see you soon, and have an excellent rest of your Saturday.